All right, so hi everyone, and welcome to the Future of Offsets and Their Role session. So my name's Kelly Hamrick, and I'll be moderating this panel. And as you may have noticed from my voice, I'm a little sick, so apologies for any coughing that this picks up. But the good news is I'll try and keep my talking to a minimum so you can actually hear from the people that you're probably here to listen to. So we've got four really fantastic speakers here today, representing views across both the United States and Canada, and across both voluntary and compliance markets. So I'm really excited to get all of them to start speaking. So to my left is Aaron Schroeder, who's the principal at Brightspot Climate, which is a consulting firm he started in 2015. And he has a technical background and has spent the last 11 years analyzing, quantifying, and auditing GHG emissions in North America. And he's conducted offset protocol validation studies for Alberta and is currently working with the Climate Action Reserve and others to advise Ontario and Québec and other Canadian jurisdictions on developing offset protocols. So he'll give us some insights about what's going on to our neighbor to the north. And then following will be Rachel Tornek, who's the Vice President of Policy and Programs at the Climate Action Reserve. And she's been with the Reserve for almost 10 years in a variety of different roles. But now is overseeing voluntary carbon offset registry and the CARS role as an offset project registry for California's cap and trade program. So she can share her views on trends and the future of offsets sort of on both the voluntary and compliance markets. And then next, and I'm introducing them in order of how they'll be presenting. Next is Brian Schillinglaw, who's the Director of U.S. Investments and Operations at New Forests. And he's also reaching, I think, his 10-year mark at New Forest as well. And New Forest is an investment management company that's based in Sydney, and they've got offices in Asia and California. And while Brian's in charge of investment strategies for U.S. timberland and environmental markets, he's going to be focusing on the California environmental markets aspect for this session. And then finally, we'll be ending with Sean Penrith, who is the Executive Director of the Climate Trust. And the Climate Trust is a nonprofit that started in Oregon to help companies comply with the state's carbon dioxide standard, but has since sort of branched out to invest in voluntary and compliance projects elsewhere in the U.S. And most recently, the trust has taken a step towards the for-profit side with the creation of an investment fund to invest in carbon offset projects. So he'll lend his insights on what he's seeing in the Northwest and across hopefully compliance and voluntary markets as well. So that's sort of what we're going to do is have each of them speak for about 5 to 10 minutes about what they're seeing, and then what I'd really like to do is just open the floor up for questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions, or if you think anything's unclear, or you have any thoughts while they're speaking, please just jot them down, and I'll be happy to call on you once they've all had a chance to sort of say their piece. So that said, let's move on to the panelists. So Aaron, perhaps you can take us away on the role of offsets in Canada.
Yeah, happy to. Conference has been fairly Canada heavy this year, which has been great. So I think everybody's heard at least some of what's going on, especially in Ontario and Québec. I'm involved in helping develop the 13 protocols that are under development for Ontario along with the Climate Action Reserve. And that process is well underway now. A bit frantic at the beginning to get a few protocols out, and the rest of them will be developed over the course of the next 8 to 12 months. Ontario won't necessarily accept or approve all of those protocols into the regulated system, but the idea is to develop the protocols now, take them up the chain, and eventually decide whether or not they'll be used for compliance purposes or potentially in a voluntary market in Ontario and Canada. Interestingly, the protocols are being developed for application across Canada, so credits from anywhere in Canada would be eligible theoretically under the protocols. We'll see how that rolls out. I spend a lot more of my time in Western Canada, so I thought I'd give you a little bit more information about what's happening there. Some interesting things happening in Alberta and British Columbia. In Alberta, if you're not aware, Alberta has had a system since 2007 allowing offset credits in from 36 different protocols. The way the Alberta system was developed, industry was allowed to bring protocols to bear for approval by the government. So industry got involved very early on and developed a number of these protocols, and that's why the number is so high. Despite the high number of protocols, a number of them have never been used for actual implementation. So the province is currently going through revising a bunch of those protocols, hopefully bringing some of them to a point where they'll actually bring credits to market. Another interesting thing that's happened in Alberta recently is the government has raised the price, the de facto price for offsets. In Alberta, you're allowed to use offsets for compliance, or you can contribute into a technology fund. So the price of that technology fund is the de facto price for offsets. That price has historically been $15 Canadian a ton. Just a couple of years ago, the government announced that would be raised to $30 a ton this year. So as you can imagine, anybody with credits held on to them, hoping to cash in on the significant increase. So there's a huge glut of credits in the market, both offset credits and some other types of credits that you're allowed to use. The government has just recently announced that they're anticipating a new policy that will limit the number of offsets you can use to 30%. So anybody that was hoping to cash in on their big windfall is now going to be delayed. And there are some models showing that, in fact, there will be this glut of credits for several years to come. So that policy is being heavily debated right now in Alberta. Whether or not they'll move forward with it remains to be seen. And then in British Columbia, a small market there, the only buyer of credits in British Columbia, besides a few in the voluntary space, is actually the government itself. There's a climate neutral government policy in place in British Columbia where government entities right down to schools and hospitals have to buy credits to offset their emissions. So offset protocols exist and have existed under the previous regulation to purchase those credits. New regulation now in place. All of the previous projects, or most of the previous projects, were grandparented into the new regulation, but the new regulation requires that all of the protocols have to go through a revamping and approval again. So there are currently no approved protocols in British Columbia. The only one that's close is the fuel switching protocol, which has been out in draft for quite a while now. So we're hoping to see that move forward and some new protocols come into place. The new regulation does anticipate new demand for credits as industries are added to the regulation. Currently, the only industry that's in the regulation is the liquefied natural gas industry, of which there are no significant facilities in British Columbia yet, so there's no demand there. But it is anticipated that British Columbia will eventually add new industries to that regulation. There's a provincial election occurring in a few weeks, and we'll see which government takes form there and how that proceeds.
Great, and one quick follow-up question, because I don't know Canadian politics that well. Are both of them pro-carbon offsets, or?
The governments in British Columbia that are up for election?
British Columbia specifically?
Yes,
okay.
yeah. Although the government that's not in power, the new Democratic government, has some other ideas about maybe using the carbon tax a little bit more heavily. So that's being debated, obviously, in the election, run-up to the election.
A little different from U.S. elections.
Yeah, yes, it's a little bit different.
Great, thanks.
Okay, great. So I'm going to speak to both the compliance market and the voluntary market from our perspective as an offset project registry under the compliance market, and then, of course, serving the voluntary market with our own Climate Action Reserve program. It's Friday afternoon after many conference sessions, and you've undoubtedly heard about the uncertainty that's affecting the cap and trade market and offsets in particular. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the importance of offset as a cost containment mechanism and an important piece of it in a successful cap and trade program. I'm going to sort of talk about what we have today on the books, what we see, assuming that, as Mary Nichols, the cap and trade glue that's holding California's carbon policies together continues post 2030. But we're going to keep a little bit more of a short-sighted view, sort of based on what's in the system already. There's no doubt effects on the market from the uncertainty that we're seeing with the reauthorization, and we've seen that already in the number of new projects that are coming into the system on our registry and the other offset project registries. We've definitely seen a downward trajectory since the end of 2015, when there was an update to the compliance forest protocol. There was a large spike in submittals, and since then we've seen, I wouldn't say a steady down, but there was a significant downward trend, and it's been slow and steady since then as far as new projects coming into the system. Another sort of interesting dynamic that's happening sort of on a moving forward basis, for a number of years we had a large number of the early action credits that were allowed into the program to capitalize on the work that had been done by the Reserve and others early on in the system. And all of those credits have now sort of materialized into the program, and we're not being issued any more early action credits. So current vintages only moving forward, which you'll see sort of in the dynamics of how many credits are issued. We do, you all probably know this if you track it, there's a large backlog of credits. So it's sort of interesting. I think there's good transparency in the number of credits that are going to show up, in the offset side of things, because you have if you're paying attention, you have the listing stage, where if you know something about the project types and the information that's provided on the listing forms, you can maybe estimate how many credits are going to come from a project. And then you have the rock issuance stage, where you get a very, very accurate number of how many credits will eventually be converted to RBOX. But we do have 26 million rocks currently that are rocks and not RBOX yet. And there are not specific timelines on when those things get converted to RBOX. So a very large portion of credits that are awaiting final approval and conversion. There's also, as I mentioned, that large sort of submittal spike in late 2015. That group of forest projects, we will start to see those come in pretty quickly here, I think, towards the, or some number of them towards the end of 2017. So there will be sort of significant volumes, I think, that will be showing up in the market in the short term. And although I said that there aren't a lot of submittals happening, we have seen a few very large forest projects, which Brian might say some more things about, perhaps, under the new version of the Forest Protocol up in Alaska. And so we'll see the effects of those, in a few years to come. Forest projects are the vast majority of the ROCs that have been issued to date. 82% of the ROCs issued, 62% of the RBOCs issued. So as far as where we expect the volume to come from in the foreseeable future, forest is playing a large role. The ODS projects come in quickly, go through quickly. We see them. That's a protocol that's based on a bank of existing material. So you would expect over time that those would decline. And then the livestock, they continue to chug along. They're low volume projects. So you see the effect of that, a large number of projects, but low volume of credits. To drop down into the weeds for a minute, people aren't talking much about it. I haven't heard a thing about it at the conference. There is a cap and trade regulatory amendment that's sort of going through the process of being approved now. And there is something in that amendment that should help to de-risk, I guess you could call, in a way, some of the livestock project activity. And that's having to do with regulatory compliance. We comb through the cap and trade regulation. So I don't know how many people know about this, but there's basically right now, if there's a regulatory compliance issue, the entire reporting period gets thrown out. You don't get credit for any of the reporting period. And there's a proposed amendment change that would limit the effect of the regulatory compliance issue to the time period of the violation. So we've seen a surprising number of regulatory compliance issues, not necessarily violations, but in the livestock sector in particular. And so I think it's been difficult for those project developers. I think because they are low volume projects, perhaps that risk has been, that's been difficult to handle. So hopefully that change in the amendment will help the livestock projects come through. The last thing I'll say about the compliance market is, there's been no word from ARB on potential new project types, but hope springs eternal. So maybe now that we'll have an updated scoping plan and the regulatory amendment gets approved, and over the next couple of months, hopefully the board will clear those things, and maybe they can turn their attention to some new project types. We'll see. On the voluntary side, the Reserve's been working in a number of areas to help grow interest and action under our voluntary protocols. And a lot of these activities I've been very happy and grateful to have funded by conservation innovation grants by the USDA NRCS, and those were granted prior to the new administration, and the funding is still there, and they're short term, just a couple of years, so we expect that funding to actually still be there for the remainder of what they've said they would give us. So on our Grassland protocol, we've built some really great tools and resources for project developers. We actually did some stakeholder engagement, the result of which was a version 2.0, which was approved by our board in January of this year, and that has made some significant improvements to the protocol, some changes around project start dates and suitability thresholds, and we've got some pilot projects that are coming through now, should be issued CRTs very shortly, and we know of a few more projects that are already headed in, so we're excited about the activity under that protocol. We've been working with the Climate Trust on some grassland projects. We are undertaking a similar set of activities for our nitrogen management protocol. So again, with the help of a SIG grant, looking at recent developments in biogeochemical process models and the science moving forward, and going to make efforts to build some tools and resources and do a version update on that protocol as well. So hopefully that will be coming in through later this year. We are also working with a coalition of folks. These SIG grants usually have a lot of players, but Terra Global Capital is the lead on it, to look at a rangeland protocol. So we are right now undertaking sort of the internal scoping process to identify the activities that we think are suitable for developing standardized performance tests and baselines, and so we expect to launch a new protocol development effort in the rangeland pastureland space later this summer. So that's a brand new protocol that we'll be undertaking. And then finally, something that we're really excited about is our own forest protocol. So not the compliance forest protocol, but our forest protocol version 4.0, which is out for comment right now, actually. So you're interested in commenting, do so by, I don't know when it ends, middle of May, something like that. And this change, we've built a standardized inventory method and tool to hopefully really be able to bring down the transaction costs for small landowners and help to incentivize participation from small landowners. That's something that I know John Nickerson, our VP of Forestry, has been committed to making the forest protocol do for a very long time. He himself being a small forest landowner. And I think that with 4.0 and the tool, the standard methodology, the standard inventory methodology that we were able to develop, will hopefully finally be able to bring that down to smaller land holdings, and it also expands it to Hawaii. So we're very excited about that forest protocol. It's actually interesting, even though there's the opportunity, obviously, for the compliance market for forests, we have seen what I think is a surprising number of forest projects stay on the voluntary side of things. I mean, it's not a huge number, but it's something like 30 projects. And I think what we see is an opportunity in forests for project developers to choose their own adventure and pick the path that suits them better, and maybe going to the compliance market isn't the path that suits them the best. And because it's a charismatic project, and we think that grassland and nitrogen management, these land-based projects are more charismatic in nature, and that they might be able to really fetch a good price on the voluntary market. So we're happy to be able to support those efforts. Generally speaking, as far as sort of reserve activity on the voluntary side, we still have over 100 voluntary projects in our system. Landfill, not very many livestock, nitric acid, a few organic waste projects, but over 100 projects that continue to verify and be issued credits and find buyers for them in the voluntary market. So it's, I think we spend a lot more time talking about the compliance side of things, but the voluntary side is still there. And then just two final things I'll just mention. If people have questions, we can talk a little bit more about it. We are about to issue tons to our Mexico forest pilot project, which actually, if you want to talk about, you should find John, because I don't know I don't know that much about the Mexico forestry protocol, but that's very exciting. It'll be the first credits issued under that protocol. And then, of course, just generally for the voluntary market, the future of the voluntary offset market. I know we had a session at the conference about CORSIA with the international ICAO. I'm not going to dissect the acronym this afternoon at this late date in the conference, but that's obviously potentially a huge market, and it's a little bit cloak and dagger as far as what's actually going to happen there and what the rules are going to be and what the reserve or other registries opportunity might be there, but it looks promising. So
one quick follow-up question. When you were mentioning you don't know yet if there might be any new methodologies in California, if you had to choose one, what would you want?
I'll pick grasslands.
Okay.
Because I think Max Dubison, who was the lead on that protocol, did extraordinary work standardizing things, making a lot of things based on default emission factors, bringing down the transaction costs. So I see it as a land-based protocol that could really work, and there's opportunity in California, and I think California likes there to be opportunity in California. So. Not that I don't love all of my children equally, all of our protocols equally. I'll pick that one this afternoon.
Great. All right. Brian, maybe you can give us some insights on California and forestry.
Sure. I think my remit today will be to chat a bit about our view about the post-2020 future of offsets within the California and Western Climate Initiative system. And we do participate actively in a number of stakeholder working groups, in addition to interaction with the Air Resources Board and the legislature. So while we're what I would fairly describe as a bit player in the policy process, I wanted to give you a view of a stakeholder as to where things are. And so, as you've heard, there's of course a very live debate about the scope of post-2020 climate action, the exact form in California. So with the passage last year of a 2030 target in AB 197, the legislature is considering multiple bills this session that would specifically authorize cap and trade as among the suite of mechanisms post 2020 through 2030. And the future of offsets really fits into that discussion. And so I think the interesting thing about it is that first the zone of possible agreement is really centering around cap and trade extension. In my view at this time, particularly with the passage of AB 197, the best alternative to an agreement among a lot of the regulated community is fairly poor because of some of the authority that was granted to the Air Resources Board under AB 197 and some of the direct command and control regulation that could take place in the absence of cap and trade. And so we've seen Western States Petroleum Association and other major industry groups come out supportive of a cap and trade extension post-2020. So as the zone of possible agreement focuses around cap and trade, the exact shape of that is I think what we're seeing up for debate. And the AB 32 really poses a challenge for an implementing agency because it demands sort of multiple incommensurate goals. It demands climate leadership of California. It demands achievement of a specific level of emissions reductions, not just a specific price on emissions, but a specific level. It demands that to avoid leakage, and it demands attention to environmental justice concerns. And so as you satisfy all those criteria, you're looking at something that emerges like the suite of policies that are in place right now. And right now, the debate around offsets, so there's the environmental justice community has come out strongly against the inclusion of offsets post-2020. Obviously, this is not news. And there's also, although the environmental justice community does not, there are a good number of groups and some vary in their particular policy direction on offsets. The regulated community is supportive. Some of the environmental community is supportive. Land conservation, of course. And so what I think we're likely to see is really a cap and trade that's tweaked to satisfy not only the existing criteria, but also deliver additional criterion in air toxic pollution and reduction in California, because that's a fundamental criteria for this going forward, that we not only see greenhouse gas reductions, but we also see air quality improvements. And I think that's also a model for climate policy for the nation. And where I believe we'll see resolution over the next few months, ideally in this legislative session, perhaps in the next legislative session, I think we'll see continuation of offsets. Offsets are economic diplomacy for climate mitigation. They are a core feature of California's climate leadership. When you have landowners around the country being paid real money for climate mitigation, that changes hearts and minds in jurisdictions that have zero climate policy. So it's not just about cost containment. It's about climate leadership. It's about innovation. And so I think a lot of legislators, and certainly the ARB, see that. So I think we'll see continuation of offsets. I think we'll see a focus on new protocols that can also deliver air toxic pollution reduction. I think there's an overlap there. And I think we'll see direction to the Air Resources Board to focus on those type of protocols. It might include, for example, wildfire risk reduction. Wildfires are one of the highest sources of particulate matter pollution. It doesn't matter a lot what else you do. If most of southern Sierras go up in flames, you're going to see extremely toxic air quality in the Central Valley. So I think we'll see those two elements. I also think we'll see, ideally, the legislature look at some of the top 10 sources of criteria in air toxic pollution and some of the top 10 most effective interventions and direct capital from the system towards those interventions. And I think while a segment of the EJ community opposes offsets, I think there's a broad agreement about the goals. You could poll everybody in this room and everybody at this conference of should air toxic and criteria pollution be reduced in disadvantaged communities, and everyone here is going to raise our hands. I have no doubt about that. And so there's broad political support of that. But I think the legislature is going to choose paths that actually reduce those pollution, those sources of pollution, and that'll get the asthma rates down. And so I think it'll be data focused. I think it'll deliver EJ outcomes. Limiting the offsets program is not going to deliver on those outcomes. And so I think that's where we're going to see the zone of agreement. I'm fairly optimistic about that. Looking out over 2020, 2030, I'm optimistic about new protocols, and particularly land-based protocols that could have a real tangible effect across the United States. And CAR has certainly performed a great leadership role in that respect.
So when we had a briefing call, Kelly said, make sure you talk about the role and the challenges. And the first point is really the challenges. And I'll distill it down to really either misinformation or the loss of the ability to digest any meaningful content anymore. And I say that because, we interact a lot of the time with the investment community, specifically the impact investment community. And, you'll see all the figures. We got to hit our sustainable development goals by 2030. It's going to cost $70 trillion. How do we get that capital from the institutional market into the project world where real greenhouse gas reductions are occurring? And, of course, as you speak to these would-be impact investors, this question around certainty keeps on coming up. And so the challenge really is being able to educate succinctly in a way that paints the picture of opportunity while being candid about those challenges. And so, the Deutsche Bank coined this term TLC, which is transparency, longevity, and certainty. You need TLC for any market, regardless of what sector it's in, to become a mature market. And if you look at the solar industry, that's pretty much what's happened. It's received a large dose of TLC. in the offset world, of course, we have got very little TLC. And at the Climate Trust, we recognize all of that. We speak to the investment community, not to say that the challenges are no longer in existence. We say it's very important that we invest energy and effort today so that when the uncertainty mists start rolling away, we're poised, along with everyone else, all our colleagues in this space. And the challenge with not only addressing the uncertainty in California has massive repercussions in the state that we're based in Oregon, that is considering a cap and trade program. I know Bill's here from Department of Ecology in Washington. And a lot of this sort of disinformation, misinformation ripples through Oregon all the way up to Washington and beyond. And it takes such an inordinate amount of energy to sort of course correct it. Brian talked about the EJ community. We spent a fair amount of time talking to the EJ, some of the EJ factions, if you will, in California. And, I moved from a dinner meeting in which they wanted to stab me with a fork to, okay, wait a minute. So let me get what you just said. Let me see if I understand what you're saying. And that type of energy and effort is really important. I think we spend a lot of time talking past each other all the time, going, well, let me get to the influencer to make the case for offset certainty or offset, the importance of it, as opposed to just sitting down with the other person and going, let's have a conversation. And so that's just a sort of broad overview of the way we see it. In Oregon, the age-old issues come up. Of course, the EJ concerns are important, but the other one is we need offsets, but they've got to be local to Oregon. Now, the Climate Trust is turning 20 years old on June 6th, so we have been around the proverbial carbon block. And when we started, our mandate was to originate credits in Oregon under the CO2 standard that Kelly mentioned. We also managed a voluntary program for a gas utility. And when we got their work, they said, we want digester projects from Oregon. And then we got the Invenergy program in Washington, and they said, you can get the picture, right? And the sort of localized focus, which I totally understand, just defies economics because it becomes very difficult to get the type of volume of credits that you need. I'm not going to speak for the clean air rule up in Washington, but the work that we've done, you can see there's a void in the amount of emission reduction units that can be used, based on our research, to comply with clean air rule. And so, this idea of prioritizing local reductions, I totally get it. I'm not going to debate the linkage between greenhouse gas and pollutants. I think both are important. If EJ wants to couple that with a high visibility cap and trade program, great, let's talk about it. Let's figure out how we can work. And I think Brian's right. We're going to see offsets post-2020, which is great, but we'll also see some language and policy and programs that address these criterion pollutants. The other disconnect which we see, well, two major ones. I'll start with the ITMO, Article 6 in Paris. So, the rest of the world is talking about how to set up this accounting under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement where we can transfer these mitigation outcomes. And yet, in America, for understandable reasons, that is not a point. I mean, we are not gearing up to the ITMO conversation. I think that's a problem. So I was talking to somebody this morning about how accounting would happen. And who's the gigaton? Is that Walmart? Okay. So Walmart's got a gigaton challenge thing. And apparently, I might be getting this wrong, but they're gonna capture all of the footprinting reductions from their supply chain in addition to their own. But some of those supply chain activities may count under some other regulatory program. And under Article 6, the accounting piece is very clear that double counting has to be avoided. And so we sort of watch the ITMO conversation around the world, not happening in America. And then the second thing is under the scoping plan piece from ARB, if you remember the most recent update, there's this piece in there which is really important, which is this focus on natural working lands. And if you saw the recent EPA report, emission and sinks report from EPA that somehow got out under the door before Scott Pruitt put his name card on the desk, It's interesting because they report on the land use change and forestry sector at about 12% of representing 12% sink potential of the entire global emissions in the US. So you've got ARB talking about the natural working lands focus, and obviously, or intuitively, to us, how do you get to that uncapped sector? Offsets. And so we don't understand why it seems like such an uphill battle to address something that is so important, which can be achieved through an existing offset, a very well-established offset mechanism. And then the other thing that we end up talking about in Oregon is, once we get past the offsets allow polluters to pay and all that stuff, when we carefully explain to them that over 20 years the Climate Trust has been investing in credits or projects. And if you look at our map on our website or any offset project map, where do they exist? Obviously, they exist predominantly in rural economies. We are putting back, the Climate Trust puts back 54 cents of every dollar that invests back into the economy, into rural economy as parts of Oregon. When we get to that part of the conversation, representatives on the House and the Senate side, they start listening. And so, so it's just kind of, I'm just putting a number of pieces together. This is all bounded by this challenge that we have, a massive opportunity to respond to the impact investors who say very simply, address the risk, show us the investable pipeline, and we're golden. But as long as we have this uncertainty churning around as all these different factions are trying to get their piece of the cheesecake, and we're unable to show the investable product, we're going to remain challenged. We're very bullish on it. We are, really. But I would change this navigating the American carbon world to adding on in the world of uncertainty. Just like federally we've got that, and in the carbon markets. And I know regulators are trying their level best to take into account different stakeholders. But they must understand the impact that it's having in mobilizing the capital. That's the problem.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. If you, when you're trying to talk to investors and talk to them about risk, if you could choose, what's one thing that you would change that would get more investors to the table?
Now, that's a really good question. If you look internationally, this country has done, and the world, has done an amazing job at mitigating risk. If you look at what the World Bank does, in terms of the price auction facility. If you look at USAID, where they provide loan guarantees, you look at JEF, you look at the Green Investment Fund, you look at all these different mechanisms that are out there. And in a word, they provide risk mitigation through some sort of financial instrument or an offtake agreement. And when I ask those same entities, the heads of those entities, who is your US counterpart that we can talk to put something like that in, either in California or Oregon or nationally? They go, that doesn't exist, cheerfully. And so that's the one thing that I would want to change, is some national federal body that said, you know what, we're going to take the uncertainty. While the federal administration figures out what they want to do, we want to provide some risk mitigation.
I think I'd like to open the floor up for questions if you guys have any. I don't know if there's a microphone that we pass around, or you can also just raise your hand and call on you, and hopefully you have a better voice than I do. Go ahead.
Just talking about the risk.
Yeah.
Is it the policy risk?
Well, yeah. So I don't think a body would address the policy risk. I think that the machinations will do. Right. No, what I'm talking about is more, so, I remember a conversation with ARB a few years ago, and they were very pointed. They said, your role in the voluntary market is to pave the way so that when it gets to ARB's postbox, you've done the work, right? That we hear that over and over. You're the incubator. So go out and incubate, whether it's grasslands or blue carbon or whatever. Well, and that's fantastic to know that the efforts we put in the voluntary market could ultimately make their way to compliance. The challenge with that is And we were the buyers of the only two, or the first two, nutrient credits in this country. The problem is that to support those nascent markets, they need some sort of price assurance. They need to know that there's someone out there. So, we're part of a blue carbon working group in Pacific Northwest. There's huge wetlands carbon potential in the Pacific Northwest. Who's going to buy it? Maybe Walmart, but there's no mechanism that says you deliver it and we will assure it. If you sell it, fantastic. But if you don't, we'll buy it. And that's what I mean. That's what we need. And I'll just point to the Farm Bill. $900 million, great work. They send you the money and you invest it. That's wonderful. But there's no leverage behind that $900 million. Zero. Imagine if they took 100 million of it and said, we will put a price assurance facility, an offtake, or whatever it is. That would stimulate incredible activity that would then eventually make its way to the compliance market in Washington and Oregon and California.
Go ahead.
Do you want to take the?
Sure. Yeah. The Mexico project is the Climate Action Reserve's Mexico Forest Project Protocol. So it is not a compliance protocol. It is not an ARB project. It will be issued CRTs by the Climate Action Reserve. Those are not able to be transferred into ARB offset credits. So it's an area that we've been working on for quite some time. I mean, as Sean said, we're doing our work in the petri dish in the voluntary market to hopefully serve things up to ARB. And I know there have been a lot of conversations about sector-based crediting and international offsets. And I think those conversations continue in Sacramento, but this is just for the voluntary market.
2025. I would bet against international offsets in the compliance system before 2025. If you want a date.
I have to write that down in my diary.
I'll address, or attempt to address, the GHG pollutants piece. The widely circulated environmental equity brief, the Cushing report as it's known, is the one that sort of got the most airplay in the environmental justice movement by saying, look, people that live within 2.5 miles of high-emitting facilities are suffering this contaminant issue. And it's very valid. At the bottom of the report, unfortunately, it says two things. One, don't use this draft document to inform policy. And then two, by their own admission, and I'll read this, it says, as regulated industries adapt to future reductions in the emission cap, California is likely to see more reductions in localized GHG and co-pollutants emissions. What does that mean? It means that the cap and trade, or the declining cap, will work as designed. And if you look at the ABT report, or ABT report from RGGI that was just released at the beginning of the year, in which they tracked from 2009 to 2014 the correlation between greenhouse gases and air pollution, assuming that you believe that their research is third-party reviewed and so on, but there is a direct link between the reduction of greenhouse gases and pollutants in the RGGI system, which has been shared now with factions of the EJ community to say, look, maybe you're just, I don't want to say they're being impatient, because you read the news and they say, look at the air, I can't breathe, and I understand that, but if they want it all to happen tomorrow, then the cash register pricing goes up, and that's the balance.
I think, in addition, I mean, there can be a correlation, but not necessarily. So there are investments that can reduce criterion. There are investments within sort of the cap sectors that can reduce criterion pollutants, but increase GHG emissions, for example, or vice versa. And then where there are correlations, like there are certainly sort of correlated criteria pollutant emissions from refineries and from cement plants with GHG. But I have not personally seen, which is not to say it doesn't exist, but I don't think it's circulating around the legislature in the sense of the top 10 sources of criteria air toxics within disadvantaged communities in California. And so and I know from a good chunk of it, for example, is transportation emissions. And so the largest source in a certain area, which is not to say this is always the case, but it could be some of the worst polluting diesel trucks, the bus fleets and so forth, but that's not necessarily easy to get at as compared to a point source. And so I think that's a real opening for California climate policy to remove the worst polluting vehicles, to go after the top sources of, and I do hope that is really focused around the data, the public health data, of what are the largest sources of criteria pollutants and air toxic pollutants in disadvantaged communities, because that, once you have it a 2/3 vote, you can use the money for anything. And it can go towards, it doesn't have to be through all the offset program, it can go towards direct the electrification of every single bus fleet in California or whatnot. And so I think that should be the goal, and that will have a very measurable impact. So there can be correlation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you're going to get the most rapid reduction per dollar invested, for example.
Back.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the short answer is that that protocol doesn't exist and is not close to existing. I mentioned it as an example of the type of protocol that could overlap GHG, emissions avoidance, and air toxics. The issue that you flag is very real, but it also steps on one of the third rails of California environmental politics, which is active forest management. So, getting a lot of mechanical forest thinning or prescribed fires in the national forests, even though that's the way they were managed by indigenous peoples for a very long time, much more effectively than the current management under the federal government, is I think would be very politically fraught in California. So I don't think there's an easy way from point A to point B.
I'm going to throw one quick question out to Aaron, because I think most people here in the audience are probably US based, but at least to my knowledge, we haven't had as much opposition to offsets in Canada from the environmental justice community than in, say, California. Is that just because all Canadians are just really nice people, or what are your thoughts on, what might be going on there?
Yeah, I've been asked this question before. I haven't been as involved in the protocol development process in the U.S., but the process in Western Canada anyway has been very collaborative, and a lot of those groups have been involved since day one, and I think a lot of the concerns have really been taken to heart through the protocol development process. And then I think there's a really good involvement in ongoing scrutiny of projects as they come through as well. So I think that's probably why, at least why in Western Canada, a lot of those projects have proceeded. There's that good collaboration that's going on between the communities.
We're not going to see environmental justice against offsets in Ontario.
I think in Ontario you might see it a little bit more than we have in the West, to be honest with you, partly too because of the connection between California and Ontario markets that's being established. And I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see some environmental justice groups that are existing more in the U.S. Participating more in Ontario. We've seen a couple instances of that already, and I think it's helping to develop stronger protocols. I think one other thing that's happening in Canada is more involvement from First Nations groups in Canada. As these protocols are being developed, there's good engagement there, and a lot of learning as well, especially on some of the agricultural protocols. I think we're learning a lot about how traditional practices are actually practices that should be considered as baseline practices for some of the protocol development.
Yeah.
So that's been fascinating and really important.
No, that's great. Well, and I think that's something we've seen in the U.S. as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I'm going to open it back up to the floor, if I can see you. Oh, yes, in far in the back. Yep, you.
Sure. The short answer is I don't know, and the longer answer is that all models are wrong, some are useful. So in terms of it's a commodity market. There will be oversupply. In general, the market only purchases sort of 12 to 18 months forward, and so you don't see hedging of offset demand a longer duration than that. So if you have excess supply relative to forward 18-month demand, you're going to see a widening of the spread between CCAs and offsets. There's no doubt that will happen at some point. If you knew the exact point, then you could trade on that. I'm not personally a trader. We manage forests. So certainly a lot of landowners seek to hedge against that kind of risk with forward offset purchase agreements for their offsets. I don't, in general, in the history of environmental commodity markets, being heavily long is not an advisable strategy in the sense of holding inventory in the hope of increased offset prices, for example. So my general advice to landowners is if they have offsets, sell them and invest that in something that they care about, either in acquiring more land or whatnot. And then to finish out on that query, a lot of it depends on the post-2020 extension, because you look at the cap and the amount of emissions reductions per year post-2020 versus now is 10x, so it's an order of magnitude more per year. And of course, as the emissions go down, then the demand for offsets goes down. But the extension post-2020 will create sort of an increased hedging horizon for the regulated polluters, and the overhang of the sort of the oversupply of allowances will be mopped up by sort of 2022, and the market will in general be net short if the market exists at that time. So all of which is to say, again, I don't know, but it will happen.
It's a long
Well
way to say.
spoken, I don't know. Yep.
Some pundits are I think in the past when we've seen the federal U.S. government radically vacating the climate space in terms of leadership. Large utilities are famous for this. And I'm wondering, A, whether you think we might actually see that uptake. Ironically, perhaps we're looking at coupled with the Garcia thing. Mitigation actually happening because of that, coming in with essentially a more stable capital base than this crazy
Can I?
Go for it.
So yeah, that's it. The COSIA thing's fascinating. So after recovering in November, we wrote up a very brief concept paper. And if you follow post-Paris, you'll notice that there are a number of nations around the world that are contemplating carbon pricing as part of their INDC. And they started this idea that came out of the World Bank to create carbon clubs. And a carbon club is a precursor to the market that would come to a country, but it would allow the establishment of registries and accounting and protocols. Okay. And so after November, we wrote this concept paper proposing the formation of a US carbon club, where corporations in the US would step up and pledge the portion of emissions for this country to meet the Paris target. We wrote it sort of like, I won't say for fun. We don't do anything for fun other than drink beer, but we wrote it and we started sharing it, and amazingly, WBCSD and Ceres and World Bank and a number of other people that we've been talking to are now suddenly interested in it, and we are pointing to the COSIA thing to say, look, here's an aviation club. Can we create a US carbon club? And so I do, it's interesting how this thing's just percolating on its own. And in fact, Ceres is next week here in San Francisco, and so I'm coming back down to talk about that very thing. And so I'm cautiously excited by where that might go.
You mentioned utilities, and I think that's a very, following up on Sean's comment, I think that's a very important split, right? I mean, because as the utilities that are tracking more with solar and distributed generation rather than sticking with fossils, I mean, this is a major, the utilities are playing against oil and gas for the future of transportation sector, of course, and they have an interest in these kind of markets that the oil and gas sector doesn't. And so I think in terms of that kind of club, the PG&Es of the world are sort of the most logical. It's aligned with their long-term growth interest.
Well, that's fine. I have one more question. So voluntary markets have a special place in my heart because I write the State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets report every year. So you have to start really liking it or you start to hate it. But I was wondering, maybe for Sean and Rachel, because I know you guys play a little bit on both voluntary and compliance, but what do you see about the future of voluntary markets? Is this something where the goal is eventually that everything sort of shifts to compliance, or do you still see it as an incubation period, or is it going to have any other roles in the future? I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Well, I mean, we've been doing this for a little while now, and I feel like every year I sort of think, we go through our strategic planning efforts, and I think, are we going to develop any new protocols this year? Like, is this going to be the year that we don't develop a new protocol, right? I mean, like, we're doing a lot to support the compliance market, and we're getting involved in some other sort of diversification things, but we continue to see a need, a demand, somebody wanting something, or there being an opportunity, or something coming together to serve in that role of, I guess you could call it an incubation. I call it the petri dish, but it's such I think it has demonstrated to be such an important part of the early successes in the California market, the fact that there were these existing protocols and processes and registries that the government could pick up. And we see, Ontario, I mean, I think all of these things are capitalizing on the efforts of a lot of the people in this room in the voluntary space. And so it's also a very exciting place to work in. So not that we can't just do things for fun, but I know as a nonprofit with an environmental mission, like, we really feel like it's advancing our mission to be involved in that space. So I guess to say, I hope there continues to be a place for that. It definitely feels like, the microcosm of California. California gets to sort of pick the winners and the losers, and we don't love that. And we've seen some of our other voluntary protocols get very little attention in the last few years, and that's sad because they're great protocols and they have a lot of integrity and rigor. But I think it's worthwhile to keep trying.
without a doubt, they're going to stay relevant. In the same way you have startup technology, which eventually becomes mainstream, there's other startup that replaces it. So innovation is going to continue to be needed. There's going to be companies that want to go beyond the bleeding edge, and so they'll be the recipients. I also think that under the SDG framework, there's going to be more and more focus on the co-benefit piece, which in the compliance market, obviously, we don't really care about. So it's a shame. And so as long as the SDG element continues to be prevalent in the Paris 195 country discussion, I think there's always going to be a need for it. So I'm very bullish, which is why we carved a section of our investment fund just for voluntary.
Great. Well, I'm glad I also have a job in the future. I think we're probably out of time. So just to wrap up, thank you all for coming. And just trying to think. So you were mentioning 2025 was when you think we might actually see some action on the world stage. Do the rest of you guys want to give some guesses of when?
I was speaking just in California, actually. California
Just in
accepting
California.
international offsets. Yeah, so that's my prediction for California.
Leave that one for the crystal ball, I think.
Well, okay, then the rest of you guys will just have to come back in a couple of years. We might have some answers then. Thank you so much.